So, welcome and thank you, everybody. I am grateful that we are here to continue to engage in this journey of being salt and light and engaging racial injustice. And I have really been challenged and learned a lot through the previous weeks and am looking forward to this week as well. We have a significant lineup once again. Eugenia will start us off and help set the context and put us in a historical story that reminds us of the context in which these issues lie. Then the presenters for tonight will be Jamie Wood, our own Jamie Wood, who's a parent and an instigator in the equity action team in her parent-teacher group at her school, her kids' school, and has a lot to bring from that vantage point. Edie Holcomb will also present tonight. She's got a lifetime in education as a practitioner, researcher, analyst, coach, author, you name it. So we're grateful to have Edie. And then we'll be joined by Amy Cosda, a friend of Jamie, a teacher in the MMSD, and an abolitionist teacher, an activist, a mother, and also on the equity action team. So it's quite a lineup. They all have 10 times more that they could say than the time allows for. So we'll get this turned over to them quickly so that maybe by the end we may have some time for some questions and for other educators among you to chime in as well. So with that, let me pray. Lord God, we commit ourselves to you and ask that you would find in us fresh and malleable and open and yielded people so that you by your Spirit may speak through our presenters and change us and grow us and transform us more into your likeness and image for your sake. Amen. Amen. So with that, I believe Eugenia is going to head us out of the gate.
Here we go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. In 1940, a boy named John Lewis was born to sharecropping parents near Troy, Alabama. White dominance was the law, and he experienced discrimination from a young age. He also went to church. Longing to be a preacher, he gathered a congregation of chickens for his early sermons on the farm. He listened also to the sermons of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio. And later, Lewis remembered that King was not concerned about the streets of heaven and the pearly gates and the streets paved with milk and honey. He was more concerned about the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, and the way Black people and poor people were being treated. Lewis would later graduate from the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee, and was ordained to the ministry. But his intense work in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s shifted the trajectory of his career to politics. Lewis is just one example of a person of faith hearing God's call to work for justice. We cannot overstate the role of the Black church in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Holding to the Exodus story since the time of slavery, Black Christians prayed and worked for justice and with the hope of a promised land on this earth and in this lifetime. In the church, Black Christians were not bossed around by white people. Black church buildings became the base camp for the civil rights movement, providing space for training in nonviolent action and organization. Black pastors stood in the forefront of leadership, and from pulpits they called for civic action. May justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a never-ending stream. Most white churches, unfortunately, stood on the sidelines. Oh, we stay out of politics. Let's not stir up trouble. We focus on personal salvation. Much later, Lewis remembered, in my estimation, the civil rights movement was a religious phenomenon. When we'd go out to sit in or go out to march, I felt and I really believe that there was a force in front of us and a force behind us. Because sometimes you didn't know what to do. You didn't know what to say. You didn't know how you were going to make it through the day or through the night. But somehow, in some way, you believed, you had faith that it was all going to be all right. About 2 years before his death, John Lewis tweeted, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble. Necessary trouble. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." Back to you.
Thank you, Eugenia. Jamie? Eugenia, if you could end your screen share, please.
I did, actually.
Ah,
So thank you, Eugenia. Some of you were with us last week when Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings was here, and she was talking to us about how she was talking about the racial disparities in education in America. And she talked about it not as an achievement gap, but she spoke of it as an education debt, meaning that it is an accumulation of factors that has led to it, and that we are all responsible and have a shared responsibility to deal with that debt. And so tonight, Edie and Amy and I are going to be kind of looking at that reality. And Edie is going to start us off. Thank you, Edie. And I am going to share my screen. So here we go.
Hi, everybody. Jamie, all I see is a black screen.
Okay, I did, all right. Do you see me now? Maybe I will share. Okay.
welcome to education. There we go.
I see something that looks familiar.
Okay.
Here we go. Thanks so much, Jamie. I really appreciate it. And putting together some of this work across different technology platforms and so forth fits really well with some of the stresses of education in the pandemic that Jamie's going to talk about in a few minutes. Rich mentioned that I've worked in a number of different roles, and I just kind of tried to summarize here so that you know a bit of the roles and the eyes through which I have seen things. Most relevant to you geographically is I worked at the UW-Madison Center for Research and Development, and the last 5 years of my very full-time career, which ended in 2009, I spent as a district administrator in Kenosha. So that perhaps brings it a little bit more local, more relevant to, well, one of the things about those different roles is as a practitioner, I was in the trenches as a teacher, principal, and district administrator. As an academic, I was on the outside looking in. As a coach and consultant, I've worked alongside of educators. The one thing that I've never been is a policymaker, and I separate that because many of the things that contribute to structural racism that I'll try to explain a little bit come about from policymakers, and I want to differentiate that they don't come from the teachers and educators that are in the schools. That in fact, they are some of the barriers that prevent people within the schools from taking actions that they would like to take. I describe myself in the now as an aspiring anti-racist. I feel too inadequate and to describe myself as a racist without that leading descriptor, that it's what I'm trying to be. I've been described as such, but I still feel that I have such a long way to go. So we're on this journey together. Next slide, please, Jamie. Through this sequence, there's been a lot of different kinds of terms used, and I'm going to try to give the three things that I'm going to try to do as quickly as I can. And I just realized that I set my timer on my phone, but I didn't start it. Now I'm starting it. That we've had a lot of different terminology. And at the time that I experienced some of these examples, I didn't always know what to call them. It's in looking back that I feel that they might help you see things to be looking for and aware of. Some of you might have seen before the two images on the left of these three. Initially, all the wording was about equality. In other words, every kid trying to see the baseball game has the same size box to stand on. So that's equal resources being given to them. In the second one, the resources have been reallocated in such a way as that all of those children can see the game. In the third, which is a much more recent addition to this image, the kids actually got to go to the game. And so as we move in, I just ask you to think about, where are we right now? Are we still trying to be equal? Are we trying to be equitable? Are we trying to really liberate and bring in everyone? Next slide. I'll just included a slide in support of teachers. I wanted to echo what other presenters have said and what Dr. Ladson-Billings said last week about this is not about painting any picture of individual teachers, particularly right now during the pandemic with trying to teach from home, maybe trying to teach part of the time at home and part of the time in person. I have never seen teachers as stressed as they are right now, and I have never seen the inequities in schooling occurring that I see right now. Jamie's going to talk more about that. And Amy is going to talk about abolitionist teaching. And what I mainly want to point out here is that just this August, the Ed Wake Research Center did a survey of a representative sample of 800 educators across the nation. And two of the questions that they asked, I'm just reporting here quickly, 84% of all those educators said they were willing to teach and support anti-racist curriculum, but only 14 said that they feel they have adequate training and materials to do so. So that's one of the things that teachers can't teach what they haven't learned or haven't been equipped to do. And that's part of where structures come in, such as professional development. So I'm going to take you back. A few of you in a breakout have heard this, but I'm going to try to give some mental pictures of some examples. And I'm going to go back to 50 years ago. Next slide. It was the 1970s. I was a beginning teacher. I had experienced the assassinations of Kennedy, King, and Kennedy, the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, the war on poverty. I thought that we were getting it done. And then life circumstances took me to a school in Alabama that had just been desegregated under court order because it hadn't been moving voluntarily on its own. And these questions are things that I started to notice and ask myself and wonder about. And in some of them, I started to get answers to, like why I saw Black children crossing the 4-lane highway when busing was supposed to be provided was because there were certain bus drivers that if they got that route, they wouldn't pick up the kids. I mentioned to some of you perhaps about the little boy who suffered through 3 days of school and finally in desperation asked me where he was allowed to go to the bathroom. The principal and teachers had funny reactions to me, and the teachers finally answered the question. They came, several of them came stomping down the hall into my classroom, surrounded me where I was sitting on a little 3rd grade level chair at my reading table. And this is what they said to me. We decided you're a Yankee and you're young, so you probably don't know that you're wasting your time doing all this stuff because these N kids can't learn anyway. Bottom line at the bottom is, as I went home that day, I said to myself, dear Jesus, now I know what racism looks like. Next slide. So that was a long time ago, but 3 years ago, it just so happened that life circumstances took me into that same area. And the car seemed to drive itself to my old school. I went in and a person who met me in the hall said, oh, I'll show you around. Where was your classroom? And I discovered that my old classroom was now the room for the Title I kids who used to be pulled together in the cafeteria to be given remedial work. And now that was happening in the classroom I had had. The library still had only the one bookcase and it still had the sign multicultural books. Imagine if you went to the library, or if we could go back to the library, and in a huge, huge room, there was one bookshelf where you could go find a book about somebody like you. The thing that was new is there was a wall of data summarizing state test scores, and my guide tells me we could really do better than this data looks, that it's the minority kids and the poverty kids that are pulling our scores down. And I thought, is this progress? We've made it from the N word to the M word and the P word, but things look the same. And I got back in my car and beat on the steering wheel and said, dear God, this is what racism still looks like 50 years later. Next slide. I put this in just to let you know, by data in 2012, 93% of the books in school libraries still feature white populations and white events. And I promised to try to weave in some very typical, very practical, easy things that anyone can do, whether they're connected to a school or not. If you're a senior like me at home wondering, change the library and you might change a life. Buy a book. All right, moving on. Another example of things that I discovered, things that I knew. I didn't have the word for it then. I'm putting the word on it now. But as you know, various periodicals put out lists of the best this and that. And I was being proudly shown a premier high school in a very large urban district. They took me first to the 4th floor, where bright sunshine was coming in through large windows, and there were beautiful vistas of God's handiwork. And the guide described the large number of advanced placement courses that they had available and the number of kids that were getting college credit. We went to the 3rd floor, large windows, no fantastic views, science labs. The guide described the honors courses that were taught here. 2nd floor, looked at the windows, classroom was nice and clean. The guide described the wide range of basic courses and electives that students could choose from. 1st floor, a strip of narrow windows near the ceiling, no posters or decorations, and the guide mentioned the remedial services that were provided there. But I left something out. 4th floor, older white teachers, and from anything I could see, only white students. 3rd floor, white teachers, a few students of color. 2nd floor, mostly white teachers, some mix of students. 1st floor, mix of teachers, but almost entirely students of color. I realized this is what structural racism looks like, and it was literally embedded in the concrete of the building and how it was used. We'll come back to this one a couple more times before we leave it, but that's an example of structural racism that I would share with you. If we go to the next slide, this is from a superintendent who knew a lot about school finance, really understood it, similar to the boxes by the fence, who said, because we have site-based management and schools manage their budget, we should look at a way to send more money to the schools who have the most needy students, who have to support extra staff and programs for students, and propose something called a weighted student formula. He was viciously and vociferously attacked by the parents of the schools that were the most affluent, did not have these needs. And that's when I first realized what the terms, the fragility of white privilege or the fear of loss of white privilege looks like. Moving to the next slide. This example I pulled from being in a school district in the Midwest. A teacher team was acknowledging that there were things they didn't like that they were hearing in the teacher's lounge. They talked about what they had already tried by getting up and leaving, but they were afraid that that was regarded as consent. They worked for 20 minutes to come up with a statement and take a pledge that this is a way that they would confront those conversations. We'll come back to that text again, but this is a way of beginning to do the anti-racist talk. One more example, a conversation that comes right up to this past summer, if you'd move it up, Jamie. Talking with a young Black man in a store right here in my town after the death of George Floyd. And because he took time to be really helpful to me, I asked him if he had a couple more minutes and if he had gone to high school in Fargo. Trying to keep this really short, he had gone to 2 high schools. He described one of them as really racist and the other as having saved his life. I asked him the difference between the two, and he talked about the second school as being a place where they listened to him and his concerns. And I asked him, if you could send a message back to that first school, what would it be? He said, it's really simple. See me and hear me. Our students could have a lot to say, and so one of the things I'm going to advocate for is find a way to talk to somebody who's actually in school, or to connect students and get their voices brought out. Next slide, Jamie. These 2 topics I'm not even going to try to get into, except to say that they are topics around which data is misused over and over. And to say, if you really want to understand, you've got to drill a little bit farther into the data to know what's the population in each school. What are the specific kinds of discipline referrals that are leading to the inequity and suspensions and so forth. So that's just, if you like thinking about analyzing things, here's a good one. So moving then to our second topic, which is where do some of these aspects of systemic, institutional, structural racism come from? One is tradition, and sometimes it's tradition we don't even know about. But if you don't think that it's really strong, try helping a school change their school mascot. Another one that's most strong that is really hard to deal with is the aspect of funding. And in many situations, we say, follow the money. Schools are funded out of federal money, state money, and local money. Gloria told us last week about how states have to balance their budgets, but the federal government doesn't have to balance its budget, and it does reauthorize the elementary and secondary education every 5 years. And when they do, they rename it. In 2002, it was named the No Child Left Behind Act. Under Obama's administration, it was named the Every Student Succeeds Act. rather a different intonation. The 2002 version is where the emphasis on reading and math to the exclusion of almost anything else, and test scores and punishments on schools if they didn't do the right things came from. So all of that comes from policymakers, and it's very much linked. In our current situation, our version of it right now is that the pandemic aid package is held up because one of the sticking points is the strings attached would require 2/3 of the money to only go to districts where in-person learning was occurring. And that's what's causing some of the stress about, is it safe to bring kids back? But all of those things contribute to making it hard to do the two things that Gloria mentioned that Jamie and Amy are going to talk about, and that's to do a hard reset and to create a curriculum that's more focused on democracy. Last point is aspects, not the teachers' unions, please see, but aspects of teacher union contracts. This is what led to the structural racism at the premier high school I told you about, because seniority was interpreted as I get more and more years, I get to choose the best classroom, I get to choose the courses that I want to teach. And what's left unsaid there is, and the rest will be taught by the newest, least experienced teachers, who then feel overloaded. Then we have teacher attrition. Then we have teacher shortages. And the inequity goes on and on. And I say that because it's not something that individual teachers can break, or that they should be judged harshly for being a part of without some support at these systemic levels. Very quickly, in closing, if you go to the next slide, Jamie. I just ask as another tip, seek first to understand. One could ask, why don't you let back kids get into AP courses? Or a set of questions that allows things to be peeled back and unpacked in a less threatening or accusatory way. Next slide. This work is a lot like dealing with an onion. You peel back one layer at a time, and sometimes you cry. Moving on. So find where your point of passion is and leverage. And I say passion because to sustain the momentum, it's going to have to be something that just burns in your heart. But two simple things. Anybody can use these words to keep the door open, and everyone can make schools a matter of very specific prayer. By specific, I mean things like, Lord, the students aren't here, they're learning online. Please protect them from all the other stuff that's online while they're out there. And I think one more slide. Just ask you to take up the torch, because for all of their problems, public schools are still the only way that many can conceive of and reach for their dreams. Thanks.
Thank you, Edie. I'm gonna pick up where Edie left off. And I'm going to kind of give you some sense of where we stand today. And I hope I don't come off as too doomsday-ish. I'm here just to kind of talk a little bit about kind of our current world, but then how we can help in this area. So let's see. So just to introduce myself, Rich introduced me, and I am not an expert in any of this. I am a former teacher, but I'm here tonight really in the capacity of co-leader of a equity in action team that's part of my children's parent teacher group here in Madison. And this group was created about 2 years ago. We started out just getting together to have a conversation about police and schools. And that actually led to a lot of conversation that was constructive and led us to look at our own schools. Not just when we talk about police and schools, we think a lot about high schools. So then we started looking at our elementary schools. And so 2 years later, it's a really important group for me personally, and I think in our community. Um, so a lot of where I'm coming from is conversations that we have had in that group. And Dr. Ladson Billings, she talked about how sometimes you have to do just a hard reset. And I think the pandemic is an opportunity for us to do a hard reset. I think that we don't want to go back to schools as usual. The normal way was not the best way. So we have an opportunity to do things differently, and that's necessary. So I have just a few things up here specific to Madison. MMSD has a stated goal of Black excellence. And so that's really good to see them prioritizing that, but just kind of based on my own children's school, I think there's still a very long way to go, especially in hiring and retaining teachers of color. I have heard the principal at my children's school talk about how, oh, there's just no good teachers of color that apply. And I think that's a pretty convenient way to phrase that to white parents. I think there are teachers of color out there, and if we have to try harder to find them, then we have to try harder. There's 32 elementary schools in MMSD, and 4 of them are community schools. And at CPC, we are partners with one of them, Mendota Elementary. And according to MMSD, a community school is a welcoming and inclusive place that builds on the assets of the community to help serve the identified needs of the students, families, and community through well-integrated and coordinated strategic partnerships. They offer lots of resources, and they work with their community as partners. And I wonder why all 32 elementary schools are not approached in a similar fashion. The discipline disparities are ridiculous. In 2011, after accounting for the relative size of the African American and white share of total students enrolled, suspensions were 15 times higher, more likely to involve an African American student than a white student in Dane County. Recently, we have removed cops from our schools, but and that's really good, positive news, but the work isn't quite done. A lot of people point to reading by 3rd grade as an indicator of really just success in life. It's very important for kids to be reading by 3rd grade. And in 2012, according to the Race to Equity report, 86% of African American 3rd graders in Dane County were not proficient. And that number is frightening alone, but then compared to 47% of white 3rd graders, it shows you that, again, there's, it's working for some. In 2018, poverty rates for African American students in Dane County were 5 times higher than for white peers. And that's just 2018. So in our realities in 2020, the economic and food insecurities right now are, it's of proportions just kind of unimagined. It's gonna get worse. This year in MMSD, they lost over 1,000 students due to people leaving the district. And one thing I was hearing on the radio recently was talking about how in some districts, they're going to be able to, their tax dollars are based on property taxes. And so in more affluent areas, they're fine. But in the more urban areas, this loss of funding, because they get funded by student, 1,000 students is going to be quite, that's going to be really hard to recover from for the district. So that's a big challenge and hurdle. But don't, one of the members of the group that Amy and I are a part of, Dr. Erica Turner, she is a professor at UW in the Department of Education Policy Studies. And in July, she created this Equity in Pandemic Schooling Guide. And at the end, I do have a link to that that you can take a picture of, or I can send it out to you later. And she goes through 10 ways for people to support public education in the current moment that we're in. And so I'm just going to kind of go through these fairly quickly. The first is to contact Congress to demand additional school funding and family supports. And that's really important and something everyone can be doing right now. Edie already spoke about the funding that's tied up in Congress. Even here in Madison, if you haven't already voted, it's really important to vote yes on this current referendum, because our schools are just going to have a big bill coming due, and we need we need to support them. Number two, advocate for measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 and find a vaccine. That we just cannot put our kids back in places that are not safe for their bodies or their minds. Number three, advocate for a district remote learning option and resources to support necessary and support that's necessary so all students can access learning. This has been one of the ways that the virtual learning disparities have been showing themselves. Some kids, even though the district and districts all over our country are trying to put hotspots everywhere, it's pretty tricky. And Amy can attest. Amy told me that some of our kids are watching from different locations where maybe they cannot, even if teachers try to get creative and get kids up doing something not tied to a screen or something, not all kids have that flexibility to be able to get up and move around or go outside. There is just a big gamut on where kids are doing their virtual learning, if they're doing it at all. And we just need to make sure that we're doing our best so that everyone has access. The fourth is demand all students have opportunities for learning that will stimulate their mind and nurture their well-being. And this kind of gets to the heart of, I think, to anti-Blackness. We can't be having curriculums that are anti-Black. And Amy's going to talk for us about abolitionist teaching. And abolitionist teaching is teaching to promote joy in children, all children, and nurture everyone's well-being. And so this is this seems small, but it's very huge. Okay, I'll stop. 5, press for a moratorium on high stakes testing, test-based accountability in grades. I know that seems crazy because most of us grew up, you know, with grades and tests and everything, and that was just kind of normalized for us. But these, there are lots of studies who are showing that these do not have good outcomes for people, and really anyone, and are used to deny funding to certain schools and certain districts. So it has some really stark consequences for schools. 6, keep your child enrolled in your local public schools. If you don't have a child, that doesn't really pertain to you, but it is something just kind of to be aware of. In this moment, a lot of people are unenrolling their children, which is why Madison lost 1,000 kids this year. Some of them are going to different districts. Some of them were going to private schools. Some of them were homeschooled. And in this current reality, they call this opportunity hoarding or white flight. And people that are looking for better options than the virtual learning that our public schools are doing, and they're taking their resources with them. And it's just like segregation, and it's having a really detrimental effect. 7, work with families and educators in your school to identify needs and share resources. I encourage everyone here, even if you don't have school-aged children, you probably have schools in that you are tied to, that you're either near or you feel some sort of connection to, and that you do have something to offer. The schools have so many needs right now. You can volunteer virtually, and so we need to be sharing all our resources, and schools need to be working, we all need to be working to identify the needs. 8, link your school district, school efforts to district efforts. Really doing this piece by piece is not going to make big structural changes, but if we all piece it together, then we do start seeing bigger effects. Number 9, support groups already doing this advocacy, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color groups. Here in Madison, there are lots of groups that you could be following, Freedom Inc. among them. They're a group that are paying a lot of attention to what kids of color are needing and saying right now. And so they're a big one that I would tune into. And then 10, spread the word to others and invite them to take action with you. And I think that's why you all are all here tonight. And I'm very just grateful to have you here. And I do hope that you take this away with you and take action. This is the cover of the book that, or a book on abolitionist teaching. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, Amy, are you here?
I'm here, I'm ready.
And this is my good friend, Amy, an abolitionist teacher here in Madison. And I asked her to come just to talk to you guys about what that means and what that is.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Edie. Thank you, CPC, for hosting this critically important conversation within this series. I'm Amy. I'm an educator, a parent, an activist. I am working toward anti-racism, and I call myself an abolitionist teacher. What that means, taking the term abolition just really, really generally, but to formally dismantle a system or a practice. And so to be really intentional about coming into the schools and saying, and echoing some of what has already been shared here, but intentionally saying this isn't right. And we're seeing that this happens locally, statewide, nationally, and it has continued to happen, that we have massive racism, both in big, obvious ways, and then in smaller ways that are just as painful and just as devastating to children and communities. And so as an abolitionist teacher, one big thought that comes to me from that book cover that Jamie shared is that abolitionist teaching is not just about a way of teaching, it's really about a way of life. And so the critical piece of that is, if you are willing to be an abolitionist teacher, you will look at practices and systems within your schools through a very critical race lens, and apply methods like boycotting, protesting, calling out other teachers, other adults within your setting who say or do things that are racist or homophobic or Islamophobic. So really having the courage to call that out, to name it, and to recognize that we all have these tendencies because we have been conditioned by the world in which we live. So it doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you a person who's on this journey to being anti-racist. And I want someone to call me out when I have erred, when I have said something, and the impact was really different than my intent. So I think that's the big part of this, being willing to recognize that it is a process and a journey. Abolitionist teaching is really focused on Black joy, on a sense of mattering and belonging within a school, of students having a safe space that they can call a home place, where they feel like they are seen truly for who they are and that they matter very, very deeply. One of the big goals of abolitionist teaching is to really restore humanity to all children in schools. We know that schools have historically been places where deep harm has been caused, and Edie spoke to that a lot in her experience, through her experiences, but to restore the humanity for children so that they do feel human. And one example of how that can happen or how that can look is if a child, this has happened to me in the Madison schools, that a child who is Black or Indigenous or a person of color will say something like, I'm not smart, or I'm in the low reading group, and that's because I'm dumb and I can't do things. And helping a child realize that there are so many systems in place historically that have put them in a place of disadvantage. It's not you. It's not you. It is the system that has harmed you and put you here. And so taking away some of that, that personal shame that children often feel over something that is way out of their control, and helping them realize that these systems that we seek to abolish have put them in this very disadvantaged place. It's not because of their inability, or that white kids are smarter than Black kids. That is not true. So helping restore their humanity and calling out those untruths. One other big thing for an abolitionist teacher, like I was saying, it's about a way of life. So an abolitionist teacher will say, I am willing to put my reputation, my home, my life on the line for other people's children. I'm willing to risk something and give up something here because I see this injustice, and it's too big to just walk away or to not say something. So being willing to put something on the line. And then the final term that I'll throw out, and this is really borrowed from Bettina Love's work from that book that Jamie showed, is the importance of being a co-conspirator. Many abolitionist teaching experts that I really admire, that's my timer to stop talking, that I really admire say it is not enough to be an ally. The bar is way too low to be an ally right now. An ally says, oh, I'm going to post this, oh, thumbs up, yep, I'm there, but they're not on the front lines. They are not willing to risk anything or get uncomfortable. A co-conspirator is standing next to you and saying, I'll put my body on the line, I will ask the question, I will risk something. I will make myself be in a vulnerable position. So That is a brief overview of what it means to me to be an abolitionist teacher. And as a group of people who care about this, ways you can support the work, I echo again what Edie said, ask children. If you don't know children, seek to read stories and share in that narrative. Buy books for libraries and schools that feature characters who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, so that children see themselves reflected in their school. And then another big way to support would be just to advocate at your local school, not the building maybe, but the district, the administrative level, and say, what is in place for anti-racism? Do you have curriculum? Do you have trainings? I'm concerned as a community member, and I'm just wondering how we can help hold people accountable. So that was a lot of information in a moment. I really appreciate this opportunity and your willingness to listen and to lean in during these really challenging and critical times. So thank you so much.
Wow. We sometimes call this drinking out of a fire hose. So much appreciation to Edie, Jamie, and Amy. And we'll need a couple minutes at the end to wrap up. So I think we have just 4 or 5 minutes for a question or two. So if you have a question for any of the three, if you would unmute yourself and direct your question. And Amy, we think your kid's adorable, by the way.
So how do we get hooked up with kids in a school that needs people to listen to students reading?
I mean, I think here at CPC, you could definitely latch on to Mendota. Mendota is already set up to take volunteers from our congregation. And, but honestly, really, no school would really turn you down. And you know, you may have other young people in your life too that, but just asking the question, the schools might be impressed by. But
Who would I contact at Mendota?
Why don't you get in touch with Jean-Rene, Ed?
Okay,
And he can link you up over there.
super, thank you.
David, you had a question?
Yeah, just wondering, has there been a push to expand the community schools to beyond the 4?
not that I am aware of, but in Amy and I's group, we have been talking a lot about parent liaisons. Parent liaisons are a paid position in our community schools, and it is a parent that is advocating for other parents in their community. And our 2 elementary schools do not have that. And we're wondering why. Why does everyone not need a parent liaison? And we don't have answers, but we are asking the question. So I encourage you to ask that question, send that right on up, because I think it's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
And to go off a little bit of what Jamie just shared, I think another challenge that our equity group has met is that it is a group of predominantly white parents. And as we come in as white parents advocating for equity, we are met with resistance from some leaders saying, who are you to come in and advocate for other people's children? And so there has been some tension, and even in the conversation about creating more community schools, it is predominantly groups of white parents leading that charge. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with a podcast recently called Nice White Parents. And so as I listen to that, it really lands for me as we have these great intentions and we want to do these big things, and our efforts are met with a lot of resistance. We have not had a lot of success in bringing in people to the group who are not white. And so then our voices, it ends up like centering our whiteness, and it becomes a very uncomfortable conversation. even though we all think that our communities, our schools, our children would benefit from being community schools. So that has been a source of some contention and frustration and just puzzlement over how to proceed.
Okay, thank you.
I hate to do this, but I'm going to need to wrap us up for this evening, and I'm going to have a few little notes here as I move us on out. First is thank you to all the presenters, and I just love how Jamie just sort of like listens to God and the Spirit prompts, and she decides to get on the PTG, and then they start an inclusion group, and then it changes into this equity action team. And I think it's a model that if each of us just listen to the Spirit, it may look differently. It may mean reading to a kid or buying books for a library or a number of different things. But I appreciate that Wood family and their engagement in this issue. We do have a partnership with Mendota School, and there are a number of things that we can do. In particular, I'll try to work with Jean-René to get a specific list out of options for involvement at Mendota, so that when we come back together next week, we can post that list of options. Secondly, I would say we have another wonderful resource sitting in this gathering tonight, who's Chris Vander Ark. And I have learned more about struggle for anti-racism in the school from a teacher perspective from Chris than I could imagine. And so Chris has said he would be willing to have people talk to him from his vantage point as a teacher at Memorial School and the district's efforts toward anti-racism and the training that they've done and the reaction from the teachers and what's going on in the lives of students. So if I'd encourage you, those of you who know Chris or even those who don't, to please be willing to get in touch with him. I think you will learn a great deal. Thirdly, just a reminder that in the Wednesday email, the racial justice team has a link to a calendar that's a journey toward anti-racism that has daily opportunities to pray, learn, and act in this journey. So please go to the Wednesday email, do a link to the calendar, and look for opportunities that will help you in this journey. Next week, we shift gears from education to criminal justice, and we'll get a picture of current realities and how the heck we got here in criminal justice from a great presenter, Dr. Karen Reece, with whom I worked at Nehemiah and Justified Anger. So I think we're in for another treat next week. And that's it, except to pray. So let me close this in prayer. Lord God, move in us, spur us by your Spirit, make us people of prayer, of learning, and of action. Help us in this journey of anti-racism by your grace and for your glory. Amen.
Thanks for watching. We hope you found this meaningful. Please consider subscribing to this channel for more uplifting and meaningful content from Christ Presbyterian Church. For more information about us, check us out at cpcmadison.org.